In this video, we'll discuss the events that occurred in 2018 in Windsor, Canada. 31-year-old Autumn Taggart lived on the third floor of this building with her son Gavin. On June 10th, the boy woke up in the morning and went to his mother's room. Her room was a complete mess. He tried to wake up his mom, but Autumn was lying still. Autumn Taggart's story received widespread coverage, and the Canadian police sought the help of their American colleagues to find and arrest the suspect. Autumn Taggart was a single mother. In 2018, her son Gavin was 9 years old, and they lived in the city of Windsor, about a mile from the border between the U.S. state of Michigan and the Canadian province of Ontario. On Saturday, June 9, 2018, Autumn and Gavin spent the afternoon with the child's father, Chris Sherwin. Autumn maintained friendly relations with him after the breakup. They both tried their best so that the breakup would not have a strong negative impact on Gavin. By the end of the day, the three of them went grocery shopping, after which Chris drove Autumn and Gavin to the building where they lived on the third floor. After that, Chris went home. Before going to bed, Gavin played video games with his mother, not yet suspecting that the upcoming night would be an unimaginable nightmare for him. It was still dark outside when Gavin woke up to a noise. Startled and opening his eyes, he saw an unknown man standing close to his bed. Before leaving Gavin's room, the stranger told him to close his eyes and go to sleep. His mother's room was behind the wall. It's on the right in this photo. After about a minute, Gavin heard her scream. Never before had the boy felt such fear. A few minutes later, silence hung in the air. His mother no longer screamed, and soon he fell asleep altogether. When Gavin woke up, it was already morning. Getting up from his bed, the first thing he did was go to his mother's room. Everything there was smashed and destroyed. Autumn was lying on the bed. At first, 9-year-old Gavin thought his mother was asleep, but when he saw the blood on her nose, he realized that she was dead. It shocked him. The boy didn't want to believe it was true. He spent the first part of the day playing on the console and watching YouTube videos, trying to shield himself from the thought that his dead mother was lying in the next room. In the afternoon, he couldn't take the pressure anymore. He started crying and decided to tell someone about it. After entering his mother's room, he took her phone and contacted his father via Messenger. He texted him that Autumn wasn't waking up. Chris and his girlfriend immediately drove to Autumn and Gavin's home. After parking and exiting the car, Chris saw his son standing behind a sliding glass door on the third floor. Chris didn't have an electronic key to enter the building, so Gavin went downstairs to let him in. He asked his son to stay with his girlfriend while he checked why Autumn wasn't waking up. Entering the apartment and then the bedroom, Chris saw that Autumn was very pale. There were bruises on her face and body, and her nose was bloody. The man immediately called 911. The police and an ambulance appeared at the address he indicated, but the paramedics had no choice but to declare Autumn dead. Based on the injuries on her body, as well as taking into account the signs of a struggle in the bedroom, it was evident that it wasn't an accident. Investigators started looking for possible evidence in the apartment. Meanwhile, a specialist in interrogating children talked to Gavin and learned from him about the overnight guest who told him to go to sleep. The boy said he heard his mother's screams, but they soon stopped. He described the man he saw in his room at night. The boy believed the man was white, of average height, and had messy hair. "He looked like he just got out of bed," the boy testified. "I think he was skinny, but not too skinny. I think he was skinny." The forensic experts who conducted the autopsy concluded that Autumn died of strangulation. Someone beat her up before she died. Moreover, there were injuries in her genital area and male DNA samples on her body. Among other things, the police had to answer the following questions. How did the perpetrator get into the apartment? What was his motive? And, most importantly, who was this man? To enter the building, people needed an electronic key. The police immediately discarded the assumption that the killer was one of the tenants of this building, since Gavin knew all his neighbors, and the man he saw on the night of the crime was not one of them. In addition to finding an electronic key to enter the building, the perpetrator needed to enter the victim's apartment. But there were no signs of forced entry on the door leading to Autumn's apartment. It could mean she let the perpetrator in herself, or perhaps she didn't lock the door. Eventually, the police will discard both of these assumptions, as they will find traces that the perpetrator climbed to the third floor. First, he went up to the balcony of the second floor and then climbed to the third. The door was open there, and he entered the apartment without hindrance. In addition to the DNA sample, the police found fingerprints, the owner of which they were trying to find. It was only 12 days after the discovery of the body that the police released the victim's identity in the hope of getting tips from the public. Authorities have asked anyone with any information that could help the investigation to contact detectives. On the night when the crime occurred, someone saw a new black SUV, presumably a Honda Pilot, in the parking lot next to the building. It was there until about 6 a.m. Detectives believed that the owner of the SUV had something to do with Autumn's death. They thought he first climbed onto the roof of his car and then went higher from there. This building's corners have repetitive decorative protrusions. They could have served as steps for the criminal when he climbed from the second floor to the third. The crime occurred at night, and investigators started analyzing the activity of mobile phones in the area where Autumn lived. In this situation, the fact that the crime had occurred at night simplified the task since most people are asleep during this time. There were not many phone numbers that were active near the crime scene. During the investigation, the detectives discovered that one of those phone numbers belonged to Autumn's neighbor. Although this woman lived in the same building as Autumn, she stated she did not know anything during the interview with the police. However, she was talking on the phone not only while in her apartment. She moved around the city several times and turned off the phone at about the same time when someone had taken Autumn's life. She was either in her apartment or next to it at that time. It was impossible to say for sure because there's always some error rate in determining the phone's location. But there was no doubt that this woman was hiding something from the detectives investigating the case, so they went to talk to her again. Her name was Michelle, and she reiterated that she didn't know or heard anything. But the police hinted to her that she could become an accomplice to the crime if it later turned out that she had withheld crucial information for the investigation. Therefore, she started talking. She said that at about 2 a.m. that night, a man they knew as Jay contacted her boyfriend and her. Jay wanted to buy an illegal substance and was interested in hiring an escort girl. All three first drove to the ATM, where Jay withdrew cash. Then they gave Jay some amount of the substance. Michelle admitted she and her boyfriend were dealing them themselves. After some time, Jay asked them to sell him more. Then, according to Michelle, she told Jay to drive to the parking lot near her building. The woman confessed that she and her boyfriend planned to rob Jay. Arriving at the building, all three took illegal substances, after which Michelle and her boyfriend decided to escape with the rest of it. Remarkably, before running away, Michelle hid a bag of the substance in her genital area. Fortunately, there are no details about how she did it, but it is worth remembering this moment. It will be important in the future. According to Michelle, she and her boyfriend ran away, taking not only the substance, but also a certain amount of Jay's cash. They ran to the building's entrance and then went up to the apartment, where they locked themselves in, sat quietly, and did not turn on the lights. Jay couldn't enter the building because he didn't have an electronic key. He couldn't shout or honk either because someone would have called the police. Moreover, according to Michelle, when they looked out the window, they saw shoe marks on the roof of Jay's car. The man drove away at about 6 a.m. Investigators assumed that Jay climbed into the building, trying to find the people who stole the substance and money from him. But he didn't know where Michelle lived, so he probably got into Autumn's apartment by mistake. The police now had the suspect's phone number, as well as his photo. These are the pictures from a camera located at the entrance to the bank, where he was withdrawing cash to buy the substance, and from an ATM camera. After checking the phone number, investigators learned his name was not Jay. The man's real name was Jitesh Bogle, and he was 27 years old and a Canadian citizen who lived and worked as a car development engineer in the American city of Warren, Michigan. He was also the owner of a black Honda Pilot SUV, and up to a certain point, he visited Canada almost daily. To get to Windsor, he only had to cross the river by bridge or tunnel. Authorities were able to track his movements and learned that he had left Canada on the morning of June 10th, the day Autumn died, and he has not returned to the country since. After the police released the information about the black SUV seen at the victim's house, Jitesh sold his car. The Canadian police contacted their American colleagues and asked for help. They learned that Jitesh was planning to move from Michigan to Washington State. His parents lived there in Kent. After giving up a good job for some reason, he decided to return to his parents' house. The fact that he decided to move, got rid of the car, and stopped visiting Canada was very suspicious. Yet, the police needed irrefutable evidence to arrest and extradite him to Canada. The Windsor police asked the U.S. National Security Agency to help with the investigation and to follow the suspect's every move. Male DNA found on Autumn's body probably belonged to Jitesh, but to prove it, they needed to get a sample of his DNA for comparison. Agents from the United States monitored all the movements of the suspect. They knew that he was preparing to move to Washington State and were afraid that he might leave for a third country. Jitesh also tried to change his appearance. He stopped wearing a beard and started wearing blue contact lenses. Fortunately, Jitesh was not very careful. One day, he went to one of the bars in Warren, where he spent some time drinking. When he finished his last glass and left the bar, the agents seized this glass and thus obtained a sample of his DNA. It took time to compare it with the sample on Autumn's body, but the result wasn't surprising. Male DNA found on the victim's body was a match to Jitesh Bogle. On August 17, 2018, more than 2 months after Autumn Taggart's death, Jitesh was arrested at his parents' home in Kent, Washington. The arrest came as a surprise to him. The man seemed to think the police wouldn't track him down. The U.S. authorities have started the extradition process to his homeland. In the extradition documents, the prosecutor indicated that Jitesh was a danger to society, at flight risk, and unpredictable. Soon after, the Canadian police charged him with taking the life of Autumn Taggart. The trial was postponed for a long time due to restrictions imposed in the country. It began in November 2021. There were 3 separate courtrooms so that it would be possible to maintain a social distance. The judge, the prosecutor, the jury, and the defendant with his defense were in the main courtroom. The other 2 courtrooms had large screens broadcasting the trial to Autumn's relatives and others. Jitesh Bogle pleaded not guilty to the first-degree life deprivation, saying that he accidentally took Autumn's life. He told how some dealers ran out of his car, stealing both money and an illegal substance from him. It upset him, so he exited the vehicle to find them. Due to the large amount of alcohol and substances he consumed, he did not remember many of the moments that happened that night. He remembered climbing onto the balcony before he got into the apartment. Autumn was asleep in her bed, and he mistook her for Michelle, the woman who had robbed him. When Autumn woke up, she started screaming. He told her to stop making noise, but Autumn did not obey. Thus, he put his hand over her mouth, as a result of which she suffocated. According to the man, he realized he had accidentally taken Autumn's life after the scream stopped. Then he performed CPR on her, but it did not help. Jitesh did not remember either how the genital injuries appeared on Autumn's body or how he left her apartment. Jitesh's lawyers asked the prosecution to drop the first-degree life deprivation charges because they believed it was an unpremeditated crime. According to them, Jitesh was not aware of his actions due to the large amount of substances he took. The hand placed over the mouth is consistent with wanting them to be quiet, not consistent with wanting them dead. Bogle did not have the capacity to form intent or to appreciate the consequences of his actions, said defense lawyer Peter Thorning. There is only one explanation for his behavior, and that is intoxication. It is true sometimes terrible things happen without us intending the result. That's what happened here. This death was not intentional. He was intoxicated, or did not appreciate that his actions were not going to cause death, he added. His lawyers also stated that there was no evidence that the defendant had intercourse with the victim. This aspect is worth paying attention to, as it will ultimately affect Jitesh's sentence. Yes, Bogle's DNA was on Autumn's body, but it was not seminal fluid. According to the lawyers, it could have been the result of cross-contamination, that is, DNA transfer from one surface to another, for example, through the gloves of a forensic expert. Bogle's lawyers tried to prove to the jury that John Lasorda, who worked in the forensic unit during the investigation, did his job incorrectly and transferred their client's DNA to Autumn Taggart's body. Lasorda's role was to photograph the scene and seize all evidence that came into direct contact with the victim. Bogle's defense lawyer Peter Thorning suggested to Lasorda that by rotating the body on the bedsheet, which the police seized, there's the possibility of DNA or fluid transfer from the body to the sheet or vice versa. It is known as cross-contamination. It isn't impossible, Lasorda testified. During cross-examination, Thorning asked Lasorda if he had received proper training to work as a forensic identification expert. Lasorda said he changed gloves between touching each piece of evidence and grabbing his camera to take photographs to prevent cross-contamination. Lasorda's examination of evidence in Taggart's room included a search for fluids, urine, saliva, and semen. That is because in cases where there is a deceased female victim, the likelihood of sexual assault increases compared to the male victim, Lasorda testified. The court heard that Lasorda found no fluid deposition that was consistent with a sexual assault. He admitted his examination of the body was limited as he wasn't a trained medical official, such as a coroner. Nothing overt on the body or around the body that would suggest a sexual assault, said Lasorda in court. He also testified there were no obvious signs of a struggle. Lasorda clarified in court that signs of a struggle would be broken furniture or glass, forced entry, tampered locks, or blood spatter, none of which were present in Autumn's apartment. However, the prosecutor had a different opinion. Recalling that Michelle hid the substance in her genital area, the prosecution suggested that the defendant knew about it and searched for those substances in the same part of Autumn's body. And although he did it with his hand, it did not change anything. He committed sexual assault. "You searched her," the prosecutor said. "That's disgusting. I disagree," said Bogle. When asked by the prosecutor why he did not call 911 when Autumn stopped breathing, Jitesh replied that he was afraid the police would arrest him because he knew that no one would believe him. "Nobody would believe me. I barely believe me," Bogle testified. Bogle admitted he does not remember much about what happened in Autumn's room. One thing he said he does recall is performing CPR on Autumn after she stopped screaming. He previously testified he recalls counting 5 or 6 ribs down before beginning CPR, and that he did 15 compressions along with 3 breaths. The prosecutor also disputed the fact that the defendant's strangulation of the victim was an accident. After all, he could have just put his hand over Autumn's mouth to make her stop screaming. Yet, he also closed her nose, thereby depriving her of the ability to breathe. And he needed to do it for some time, which meant he understood what he was doing. Autumn's son, Gavin, who has since turned 13, also testified during the trial. The boy testified in another room in the courthouse, separate from the main room where the judge, jury, lawyers, and accused were sitting. He was with a support worker while giving his testimony. That's how he described the events that happened that night. "Some person came into my room and said something that I don't even recall. He was kind of close," he testified, also saying no contact was ever made. "When he left my room, it was quiet for a little bit, then I heard screaming coming from my mother that night. That scream lasted for a while, then ended, and then as I knew it, I fell asleep again and I woke up." In the morning when the boy woke up, he went to his mother's room. "Everything was knocked over, broken, destroyed. My mother was sleeping. Well, that's what I thought at first, but there was blood on her nose, coming to the conclusion that she was dead. She was killed," he said. "I was in shock. I couldn't believe it. I cried, but I tried to deal with it. I just continued my day without even worrying about it, the boy testified. He said he played games and watched videos on YouTube for part of the day. It was on June 10th, 2018. It was only later that day that he sent a message to his father from his mother's phone. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to tell someone about it, Gavin said. Chris Sherwin, Taggart's former partner and father of their son, testified that he last heard from her via text message around 12:30 a.m. on June 10th. In the morning, he texted again, but no one answered. At that point, he said he became worried. It wasn't until later that day that he said he received a text from Taggart's phone. He quickly realized it was his son. A copy of the text messages was displayed in court for the jury to see. On December 1st, 2021, a 12-person jury found Jitesh Bogle guilty of first-degree life deprivation. They found no convincing evidence that Bogle had intercourse with Autumn. Can't say we weren't nervous. It's definitely the right verdict. Autumn deserved this. Her son deserved this, said John Taggart, Autumn's father. Justice. That's what we wanted. That's what we got. The family members hugged each other and showed visible signs of relief. On January 5th, 2022, the court sentenced Jitesh Bogle to life imprisonment. He will have to spend 25 years in prison before he has the right to apply for parole. He appeared via video in jail, wearing an orange jumpsuit and a black mask. He sat against a wall, distant from the camera, while hearing the victim impact statements. At the end, the judge asked if he had anything to say. It's hard to express the sorrow and remorse I feel. I am happy for the family that they have a sense of justice and they can move on. Part of my soul died that day as well, Bogle said. We'd still like to see the laws in Canada change for life changes to actual life, not 25 years and then parole. We'd like life to mean life for all victims, said John Taggart.